I'm happy to present. I'm sad to present. I have mixed feelings about presenting to you the Doombringer Necromancer, or Doom Necro, or Proc Necro, whatever you want to call it. This is something that I widely get asked all of the time of, can you fit Doombringer, and can you fit X-Falls onto a Blight Necromancer build and get big returns? They're items that have high lucky hit chance, abilities to proc AoE damage. It also does shadow damage according to the types that you do. Doombringer has this great ability of applying a damage reduction to the monster as well, which is a very powerful effect. And I get asked all of the time, can you fit these onto Blight? Would they be good on a Blight build? And it makes sense because the majority of the time when you look at something like this, it says it gives you a lucky hit chance to help trigger it, cooldown reduction, which is a big stat on a ring nowadays, and then your damage over time effects have this huge ability to do a massive AoE damage. It can crit, it can benefit from the majority of your stats. Would it be good on the build? Well, the short answer is no. And this is the same reason why Infinimist in this season has been completely swapped over to just a strictly worse damage over time Blight build, as opposed to continuing to chase these proc effects. But I figured I still want to put out this video because I put a damn good amount of time into trying to make this build work, getting good stats. I had to eat 4 different Uber Uniques just to be able to make the Doombringer itself. And while I am going to use it for other builds and other testing, I'm just sad to say the thing doesn't do what you expect it to do. And I mostly want to use this video as a way to kind of show you all what I've done with it so you can get a better idea of what you might want to test, what you might want to change, what you might want to play around with, and the pitfalls that I fell into, and kind of my takeaway walking away from something that theoretically, especially with the massive doubling of damage on this Uber Unique, should have led us to a build that functions. But in Season 4, these things just aren't good enough. So the major conceit of the build is that we have a lot of lucky hit chance effects that we want to be able to proc, so we need to find a skill that can proc all of them, and then systems that are going to empower that damage further. Doombringer has a 25% lucky hit chance. This can trigger off of any of your skills, and it's going to deal shadow damage. All right, great. We have a really awesome starting point right here to be able to build off of. Let's find ways of boosting our shadow damage. Let's use systems that can reliably proc shadow damage buffs, and let's find ways of incorporating a skill that can also proc our secondary large damage effect. In fact, it's significantly higher damage effect, and it procs more often, in the form of X-Falls Ring, a 50% chance to do almost double the damage of Doombringer. And while it doesn't carry along the 20% damage reduction effect, it does just add on a very large amount of additional damage and gives us redundant triggering effects here. Add on top of that, while they did nerf it, we can still gain access to the Elemental Surge Temper, which gives us another 40% lucky hit chance, be able to deal a decent amount of shadow damage, which can also crit, but this one can only hit a singular target. Think about this as a way of kind of amplifying our Shadow Blight damage, which does work as an additional trigger effect from all of this, and we're looking to scale critical strike chance, critical strike damage, and then adding on as many generic multipliers as possible, because we do run into one little issue, which is that none of these triggered effects count as a skill. They don't have any skill tags. They're not considered darkness effects. They all just happen to do shadow damage. To be able to pilot the build to the best of our ability, we're looking for some key stats here. We want a large amount of attack speed because we need to be triggering some effect as quickly as possible to get the most instances that have an opportunity to proc lucky hit. To that second point, we also need a ton of lucky hit chance, because the higher that we can get the base chance of this triggering, the much more often and consistent we can rely on these damage sources. And it turns out that consistent DPS is one of the major pitfalls of the build. But before we get into the downsides, let's just finish with the stats. To be able to empower our build to the highest possible form, we're going to need a ton of critical strike chance, because again, all these various effects can successfully critically strike, and gaining that additional 50% damage multiplier, as well as things like grasping veins for another damage multiplier, and then sacrificing our Iron Golem, which is now even more powerful due to the buff to the sacrificial aspect. And we're looking for crit, lucky hit chance, attack speed. To be able to further support that attack speed, we're going to need a lot of essence per second, resource cost reduction, and resource generation, because we basically want to be spamming our key skill here, Blight, as often as possible. Now, why are we using that Blight skill? Well, Blight skill itself, out of all of the darkness skills that we could be using, does have the highest amount of lucky hit chance, and it has 13 total damage instances over which it can proc lucky hit. The initial strike from the actual bolt, and then 12 damage instances in the damage over time puddle that it leaves behind, and these can stack up infinitely. The more attack speed you have, the more of these you can have going simultaneously. The reason why you wouldn't use something like Bone Spear here, which actually has a much significantly higher base lucky hit chance, is that one, it is not a darkness skill, so it can't trigger things like all of our shadow and darkness skill passives from Gloom, and adding on another critical lucky hit chance effect like Crippling Darkness, but it also wouldn't allow us to trigger Shadow Blight, the biggest overall multiplier that we can possibly put onto a build like this. But the second part here is that Blight is relatively low in essence cost, and it also carries along with it an innate additional 20% damage bonus just from the target standing inside of our Blight, and then also adds on a ton of crowd control, which is key for us to be able to stagger bosses and be able to stack damage as fast as possible. So when you put all of that together, you realize you're going to need some core key aspects here that are going to further empower us. So we're going to be using things like Damned. Damned just increases shadow damage the moment that we curse a target, so that's going to work for all of our effects. Obviously Blighted itself, and the major issue here is that we sadly can't fit it onto our amulet. There we're going to be putting that Grasping Veins. This is going to help us actually reach 100% crit chance with and without Bone Storm up, and on top of that you can add on really strong additional effects onto your amulet. You'll notice that none of the gear that I'm wearing is going to be like bad gear. I double crit on a max plus gloom rank here, just to give you an idea of like how much power I put into this build. I got max ranks on things like Crippling Darkness, huge amounts of crit chance, lucky hit chance, greater affix lucky hit chance, greater affix lucky hit chance, just tons and tons of greater affixes to very specifically empower the things that we need to do in the build. So okay, great. You have all the stats to handle proccing things and actually getting the damage out. We can consistently cast Blight without stopping, as long as we're willing to use a resource cost reduction potion. Now, what else do you need on the build? Well, we need a ton of survivability, because unlike things like Shadow Bloodwave and Blight with Void, we actually don't have a ton of stopping power. All we can really do is rely on Corpse Tendrils to be able to apply a huge amount of crowd control and make it more efficient for all of our damage over time effects, and then AoE damage procs to actually hit. So we're going to want to fit on things like a ton of additional maximum life. We're going to need things like Hardened Bones, obviously for damage reduction, Shielding Storm for barrier gen, which I'm going to test this in a separate video. I don't think it's working right. I've never felt squishier than walking into this patch on the exact same builds that I previously could just stand next to monsters and kind of completely ignore. But look forward to that in the future. Obviously, we're going to cap our armor, we're going to cap our resistances, and we're going to pick up as much damage reduction as we can possibly fit onto the build. I'll include a planner down below just in case you kind of want to test this out yourself. But now let's talk about the problems with the build, because I just showed you how I did it. I explained everything about what you kind of need to do to make it successful, but what is the issues with it? Why doesn't it perform well? Well, it comes down to consistency of damage and the ability to properly control the monsters around us. Unlike a normal Blight build that's doing damage over time, which has huge multipliers from like the Wither legendary node, etc., the damage that we do is going to come out in massive chunks, kind of when we get lucky. Now, the Blight skill itself is carrying a 70% lucky hit chance, because I'm even going so far as to use Greaves of the Empty Tomb, and don't forget, these things had a greater affix on damage reduction, and on top of that, I successfully crit on Shadow lucky hit chance here. But a 70% lucky hit chance effect here, based off of let's just use X-Falls, says that I should expect to trigger X-Falls roughly 35% of the time, because you take your skill coefficient and you multiply it by the effect. Now, you go, wait a minute, 35% of the time, only about a third of the time you're triggering X-Falls. That doesn't seem that great. And that's when you kind of realize the problem here. If X-Falls is only supposed to be triggering 35% of the time, that means that Doombringer is triggering half as often as that. Yep, that's a whopping, 17.5% of the time you're expecting to trigger Doombringer. And while Elemental Surge at least has a higher lucky hit chance than Doombringer, its damage value is so much lower that it's kind of just sprinkling on damage. And ultimately, I would swap this thing over to something like Bone Storm Duration, or even just Blight Cast twice, just to have an even higher chance of being able to proc these things. But even though X-Fall's base damage is incredibly high, we run into another issue where we're not able to scale it as hard as we can because we're using a one-handed sword and a focus. In fact, if we were just using a two-handed scythe, the damage on X-Falls would be significantly higher. Just swapping over to a two-handed weapon is actually going to increase the base damage here by over 10,000. So we're going to go from doing 42,000 damage here to 53,000, almost 54,000. That's an increase of 25% expected damage outcome on X falls, which unironically, if I was looking to redo this build, I think I would only worry about this and then get the benefits of a double effective temper, both for damage as well as, again, like Blight Cast Twice or Bone Storm duration, because I really felt like survivability was one of our major issues. But I feel like these numbers together help to illustrate why, instead of doing like about 2 billion DPS on Blight that will consistently output that damage because it's doing consistent damage applications every single time and it's not waiting for some kind of weird lucky hit chance lucky streak. Whereas things like Doombringer, even with the ridiculous amount of lucky hit chance that we have right here, should not expect to proc the vast majority of the time. If I told you something had like an 80% chance of working, you would expect it to work a pretty decent amount of time. You expect it to work the majority of the time. Unless you're playing something like Pokemon, where even a 95% chance to hit will always miss. Shoutouts to my friends who play Pokemon. But it turns out that applying a smaller amount of damage consistently will vastly outperform applying a higher amount of damage much less consistently, no matter how many times you run the simulation. And all of this is to say, the DPS itself actually wasn't that great. I think when I was maxing out before I had stacked on all of this additional survivability to critting around about 100 million damage once I had all my buffs up, Flesh Eater fully procced on Shadow Blight, having all my triggers of Gloom as well as Terror on a target with the boss staggered. So even if I was consistently triggering 100 million damage crits, let's call it every single second, that gives us a whopping 100 million DPS. And while that might sound like a big number, again, Ebon Piercer Blight, before they changed anything to the pit and before they buffed us, was doing just about 2 to 3 billion DPS when the boss was staggered. That's a big difference. 100 million to 3 billion, that's a lot of additional zeros and factors of 10 before you can close that gap. So where does that leave me on Doombringer? Well, I guess I feel a little bit validated. I now have a concrete piece of evidence to be able to sit down in front of people who are asking about using this item for damage. Now, keep this in mind. You can just throw on Doombringer if you want. You get a ton of maximum life. Like if I were to take this off right now, I would be losing 11,000 maximum life. It gives you a cool little AoE effect that is going to give you more damage reduction if it's working. Hard to say whether or not that's true, but it is something that you can do. You can just put on whatever item that you want. But when you are looking at a Blight build and you're asking the question, what would it take to make something like Doombringer or even X Falls, nearly double the damage, nearly double the effectiveness chance to proc with many less restrictions vis-a-vis putting on different items? Is it good on a Blight build? The answer is absolutely not. Even fully investing in critical strike chance, critical strike damage, as well as proccing as many damage multipliers as you possibly can for it, it's just worse than having a skill that does at least as much or slightly more damage consistently. And that's generally where I kind of want to leave it off. I wanted to finish the build. I thought it had a chance of doing something cool, especially with the huge additional damage bonus to Doombringer, but I think it kind of just proves the point that, like, unless you're just using it as a little bit of extra damage, or maybe you're using it to trigger a very specific effect for your build, or you just like the maximum life, Doombringer isn't for the Necromancer. It's just bad. It's just a bad item for the Necro. Now, can you use it on a Blood build? Sure, you can throw it onto a Blood build, get a huge amount of maximum life. You're going to lose out on a ton of multipliers, but at least Blood builds don't have good tempers to put on their weapon anyways. And that's actually another one of the biggest issues here. Using a unique weapon needs to have a ridiculous stat line and effect for it to outperform the tempers that we currently have in the game. And again, most notably, the tempers that you can then put onto a two-handed weapon to get double effectiveness out of them. So any stat line on an item like this has to drastically outperform that, and I just don't think that Doombringer does. Now, is there any hope for the build? No, there just isn't. Can you swap it over to a Sever build? Sure, but then you lose X Falls, the thing that procs twice as often and deals twice the damage. Can you, again, just toss it onto a Blight build? Sure, but then you lose Doombringer itself, and you haven't really empowered Blight's damage in any meaningful way. Can you at least rejigger the various stats that I have on here? Yeah, you definitely can. A little bit more cooldown reduction, making sure that you're hitting crit cap without needing to use Bone Storm's crit so that something like Grasping Veins can just do it itself. Yeah, can you throw on a different temper here? Also yes. But that was probably one of the biggest issues I was kind of running into. There aren't any good tempers for the damage type that you want to do. This build really doesn't want to stand next to enemies. It actually wants to be shooting from far. So you could go with damage to distant, but that's a stat that shuts off the moment that things get close. And sometimes you just kind of have to brawl things. Do you want to go with just damage to close? Sure, but the moment that you're running away from the various pit shadow boss mechanics and you're just trying to fire from range or stay out of the way of trouble, you lose your damage there too. Can you go with generic damage? Yes, but unlike a damage over time build, generic damage doesn't like double dip just because we're doing shadow damage. It doesn't add anything extra, so it's a very non-niche damage source, so it's very low. Now, the last thing that I'll say here, and it might be asking the question like, why'd you put out a build guide and a planner for this thing? And it's because, well, you don't find out that a build is bad until you test out the build. I think I tried my best to replicate what this build should be doing at any given time, and I think I put my best foot forward. So I want to share that information again with you all in case you're testing out something similar. You kind of want to just like bounce it off of the wall. That is the ideas that I put forward, and maybe you come out with a different outcome. Let me know down in the comments. I'd love to hear from you. I know a lot of people were excited about trying out this build, so if somebody else figured it out, I would love to be proven wrong, because I think that this is super cool. I've been trying desperately to have Doombringer be relevant for the Necromancer for a very long time, and it just keeps falling short. But again, let me know down in the comments if you're brand new here and you at least appreciated the honest portrayal of the build here. Go ahead and subscribe to the channel. You don't want to be missing on anything like this. And also toss a like onto the video if you wouldn't mind. It helps me out drastically. But thank you very much for watching this video. I truly hope that helps you to at least, I don't know, maybe save out those 4 resplendent sparks and not salvaging stuff to be able to try this out yourself. And I look forward to seeing you in the next video.